9:13 in the morning, 220 miles east of Cape Cod. The newest, quietest, deepest diving submarine on Earth radioed her escort ship that she was experiencing minor difficulties. 5 minutes later, the men above her heard a sound like a compartment collapsing. 129 men were gone. She was 20 months old. She'd just finished a 9-month overhaul at the very yard that built her. A rescue ship was riding directly overhead, and she was doing the most routine thing a new submarine ever does, proving she could go deep. By nightfall, the Navy was searching an empty patch of gray Atlantic. She lay 8,400 feet down, broken into 6 major pieces. Nothing aboard her had been skipped. Everything aboard her had been designed, inspected, approved, and signed for. This is the case file of the USS Thresher, the first nuclear submarine ever lost at sea. We're going to try it like a court case. Line up every suspect, test each against the evidence, and find the assumption that turned a boat which worked on paper into a wreck. Thresher was the lead boat of a new class, built at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, and commissioned in August 1961. 279 feet of teardrop hull, 3,770 tons submerged, driven by a single Westinghouse S5W reactor turning one screw. Her hull was HY80 steel, and that steel bought her the thing the Navy wanted most: depth. The Bureau of Ships authorized her to dive to 1,300 feet. The skipjack class she was descended from was cleared to 700. She could hide almost twice as deep. 129 men rowed her that morning, 16 officers, 96 enlisted sailors, and 17 civilians from the shipyard and its contractors. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey, had held the job for 3 months. He'd been executive officer of a boat that surfaced at the North Pole. Now, the overhaul. Thresher's seawater and air systems were held together in part by silver-brazed pipe joints, not welds, sleeve joints with molten silver alloy drawn into the gap by capillary action. In critical systems, she carried more than 3,300 of them, 2 inches across or larger. Ultrasonic testing of those joints was brand new in 1962. Every joint the yard opened up got tested. Of the joints nobody had touched, 145 were checked on a not-to-delay vessel basis. 14% came back substandard. Extrapolate that across the boat, and you get 400 bad joints. Nobody hid this. It's in the record. The arithmetic simply implied more inspection than the schedule allowed, so the untested joints stayed untested, and she sailed with roughly 2,855 of them unexamined. The risk was accepted by people who believed they had sized it correctly. They had reason to believe it. A year earlier, the diesel submarine Barbel lost a silver-brazed joint in her engine room at 600 feet. She flooded to the deck plates, and she surfaced anyway. 6 boats had suffered joint failures by then, and all 6 came home. Her escort on 10th April was the submarine rescue ship Skylark, 205 feet long, with a McCann rescue chamber on deck. That chamber could reach a submarine lying in 850 feet of water. Thresher was cleared to twice that. Nobody thought the gap mattered. The 2 ships met at 6:35 in the morning, over water nearly 1.5 miles deep. At 7:47, Thresher reported by underwater telephone that she was starting her deep dive. She would check in with the Skylark every 15 minutes. The plan called for stops on the way down at 400 feet, 650, 1,000, and 1,300, checking for leaks at each one. The whole descent was budgeted at about 2 hours. Everything read as ordinary. The check-ins came in on time. At 8:53, she reported her depth as test depth minus 300 feet and kept going. 10 minutes later, she was at the bottom of her authorized world, 1,300 feet beneath the Skylark, with something over 500 pounds of pressure on every square inch of her hull. At 9:09, an undersea listening array hundreds of miles away recorded something strange in her electrical signature. The frequency of her power began to wander. Then came the hiss of high-pressure air entering ballast tanks. That noise ran for about 90 seconds, and stopped. At 9:11, the acoustic record shows her main coolant pumps stopping. In an S5W plant, that means an immediate reactor scram, and by procedure, steam isolated from the propulsion turbines. In one stroke, she lost her engine. A submarine with no speed through the water cannot fly herself upward on her planes. At about 9:13 came the sentence that has haunted submariners ever since. Skylark's navigator, Lieutenant Junior Grade James Watson, heard it through the underwater telephone. Experiencing minor difficulties. Have positive up angle, attempting to blow. The voice did not sound panicked. Skylark cleared her to surface. Nothing came back. Around 9:17, a final garbled transmission arrived, carrying the number 900 and, by some accounts, the words test depth. Skylark's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Stanley Hecker, said it sounded like a ship breaking up, like a compartment collapsing. At 9:18, the listening arrays recorded the hull imploding. Skylark waited. At 10:58, her crew began dropping small grenades into the sea, the prearranged signal meaning, "We've lost you, come up or answer." Nothing answered. The first things the search found were an oil slick, some rubber gloves, and scraps of thick yellow plastic. Finding her took months. On the 22nd of April, the research ship Atlantis II got a bump on the seabed at 8,400 feet. So the Navy shipped the bathyscaphe Trieste from San Diego through the Panama Canal to Boston to go and look. Trieste was a deep-diving float with a forged steel sphere slung underneath. In August, her crew reached the debris and called it an automobile junkyard. They saw sail plating still carrying the number 593. That junkyard was now the best witness the Navy had. So the Court of Inquiry, convened under Vice Admiral Bernard Austin, had to reconstruct a death from three things: a few garbled words, a sound recording, and wreckage a mile and a half beneath the surface. It heard 120 witnesses, reviewed 1,700 documents, and examined 255 exhibits. Suspect 1, the hull. Was 1,300 feet simply too deep for HY-80 steel and its welds? The evidence says no. Thresher had been to test depth before, with Admiral Hyman Rickover himself aboard. That morning, she reached test depth, reported in, and went on talking for minutes afterward. Suspect 2, the crew. Read the record, and you find men doing the right things in the right order. They identified a problem, held a positive up angle, blew ballast, and told their escort. What the record inducts isn't the men. It's a training pipeline stretched thin by the Cold War. Suspect 3, the reactor. It scrammed. That's an alarming word, and all it means is that a safety system worked perfectly, dropping the control rods and stopping fission. The reactor didn't kill her. The trouble was that her safest reactor response and her only escape from depth wanted the same minutes. Suspect 4, a silver-brazed seawater joint in the engine room. That was the court's finding. A joint lets go and water at 500 psi doesn't pour. It atomizes. Spray reaches an electrical panel, breakers trip, pumps stop, the reactor scrams. Circumstantial, but a 14% failure rate is hard to ignore. Suspect 5 is the one this episode convicts. Thresher's emergency main ballast tank blow system was a new Bureau of Ships design. Every component in it had been approved. The complete system had never been tested as a system in a simulated emergency at depth. And the valve maker had added strainers. Here's the physics nobody had written a requirement for. Air stored at 4,500 pounds per square inch, dumped through reducing valves, expands and turns brutally cold. Any moisture riding in that air freezes on contact. Ice builds on the strainer mesh, and the emergency air system quietly throttles itself shut. The Navy proved it afterward on Thresher's sister boat Tinosa in a dockside test simulating a blow at depth. Ice formed on the strainers. The airflow lasted seconds. Analysts concluded the strainers likely froze about 30 seconds into a first blow. Now recall the acoustic record. Blowing noise, 90 seconds, silence. And there's the unexamined assumption at the heart of this file. Every piece had been proven. The chain had never been proven whole, under pressure, in the cold. The Bureau of Ships had no design requirement addressing ice blockage in a deballasting system at all. She was still falling, so the verdict isn't a villain, it's a mismatch. Thresher could dive nearly twice as deep as the boats whose emergency habits she inherited, and depth is unforgiving arithmetic. Below test depth, a submarine without propulsion has minutes. Her escape system had been validated for a world that no longer existed. The Navy's answer was fast and permanent. On 3 June 1963, 54 days after the loss, it created SubSafe. The requirements were issued that December. Nothing inside the watertight boundary goes in on faith anymore. Every claim needs objective quality evidence, a traceable fact, not an engineering opinion. Look at the numbers either side of that date. From 1915 to 1963, the United States Navy lost 16 submarines to non-combat causes. Since 1963, it has lost exactly one, the Scorpion, and the Scorpion was never SubSafe certified. Air dryers went into the high-pressure air systems fleet-wide. The human ledger doesn't close with the wreck. A citation for Harvey's service under the Arctic ice was presented to his widow Irene that July, 3 months after the loss. Tilmon Arsenault's daughter Lori was 8 years old that April, and she has spent her adult life keeping his crew's story alive. Now, what's genuinely disputed? The Court of Inquiry said flooding started it. Bruce Rule, once the lead acoustic analyst at the Office of Naval Intelligence, and retired Captain James Bryant, who commanded 3 Thresher-class boats, argue the sound record shows an electrical bus failure at 9/11 and no signature of major flooding. Bryant sued for the files in 2019. In 2020, a judge ordered roughly 3,600 pages declassified, released in batches, and posted publicly by the U.S. Naval Institute. What they revealed was not a cover-up. What they revealed is that no single cause explains this loss. Honest verdict, which spark started it is unprovable from what survives. Both accounts converge on the same 2 failures anyway, a reactor down and a blow system that would not blow. She was certified to reach a depth she was never certified to escape. And now you know the real story of the USS Thresher. 60 years on, her families still gather every April at Kittery, Maine. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new along the way. And as always, stay curious, stay careful, and remember, every failure is a lesson somebody paid for.